All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking Justin Quack's deep dive into a pretty fascinating concept: why Jesus intentionally avoided traditional organizational structures. You know, if you ever look at the massive, highly structured religious institutions we have today and wonder how they actually connect back to their founder, well, you are definitely not alone. We're going to explore a really compelling argument from the source material, the idea that the original blueprint for spiritual impact was entirely different from the calendar-driven, building-focused organizations we're so used to seeing. So let's explore why Jesus bypassed the institutional route and what that actually means for our understanding of purpose and community.
So the source kicks things off with this incredible, honestly kind of counterintuitive story, the Gadarene demoniac. Picture this. The text describes a guy who is in a total downward spiral, living out among the tombs like an animal, breaking actual chains, just completely ostracized from society. Then Jesus heals him, casts out a legion of demons, and completely restores his mind. And naturally, this guy is incredibly grateful. He begs to join Jesus' traveling group. He wants to be right there in the core team. But, according to the source, Jesus surprisingly says no. Instead of recruiting him, Jesus just sends him right back home to his own people to share what happened.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. By today's institutional standards, the author points out that Jesus basically did everything wrong in that moment. I mean, think about it. If this were a modern ministry, he would be in serious trouble. He didn't capitalize on this massive, highly public miracle. He didn't take up an offering or ask for donations. He completely refused to plant a local church or set up some kind of permanent headquarters in the area. He didn't even get any follow-up contact details to track the guy's spiritual growth. And he certainly didn't turn the whole thing into a multi-day revival meeting. By modern church growth metrics, this whole interaction would be labeled a total organizational failure.
And that story perfectly captures the massive paradigm shift the text highlights. It is the ultimate contrast between the modern church's reliance on predictable calendars versus Jesus' fluid, journey-based approach. Just look at the difference. You've got the modern ministry approach. It's highly cyclical, very calendar-based with your typical Sunday services and Wednesday small groups. It's laser-focused on buildings, and it emphasizes prolong the meetings to drive growth. But then, look at Jesus' actual approach. It was journey-based, unstructured, and honestly, almost chaotic by comparison. He prioritized spontaneous individual encounters, he rarely repeated events, he cleared the temple twice, fed crowds twice, and that was pretty much it. He never once tried to institutionalize the moments that worked.
Which, naturally forces us to hit pause and ask a pretty profound question. What are the actual true goals of ministry? Are they to build a huge, enduring organization with a perfectly predictable weekly calendar? Or is the goal something entirely different? The author is really challenging us here to rethink the foundation of this work, asking if the heavy machinery of modern structures has actually ended up replacing the original dynamic.
Well, the crux of Quack's argument is that Jesus sidestepped all those rigid structures because his primary goal was incredibly straightforward, just introducing individuals to the Father. He was now to build a massive, enduring institution. For Jesus, the objective wasn't to create a highly structured community to repeatedly do church every single week. Instead, he wanted people to have life-altering individual encounters that were led by daily divine guidance. Think back to the demoniac, right? Jesus sent him back to his family to impact his immediate community organically. The goal was a direct, transformational relationship with God, not just handing someone a membership card to a new organization.
To really hammer home how far outside the institutional walls Jesus operated, the author pulls in this incredibly evocative quote from Mahatma Gandhi. God would not dare appear to a hungry man except as a loaf of bread. Jesus didn't just sit around in holy places waiting for people to come to him on a scheduled day of the week. No, he met people exactly where they were, in pubs, at water wells, right in the middle of chaotic marketplaces. He engaged with people exactly at their point of need, entirely outside the confines of organized religion. The author makes a really sharp point here. Modern structures often try to remove new believers from secular spaces, but in doing so, they completely neutralize the impact those individuals could have on their actual communities.
And that feeds right into the source's core argument. For Jesus, everyday life was the ministry. Literally, he totally erased that artificial line we love to draw between the secular and the spiritual. Interactions just happen naturally through daily living. Think about the woman touching the hem of his garment in a crowded street, or him inviting himself over to Zacchaeus' house while just walking through town. This model completely eliminates the need for special holy places or designated meeting times. It assumes a 24/7, constant fellowship with God. It wasn't about inviting someone to a building. It was about bringing the divine directly into the messy, completely unscripted reality of everyday life.
Now, to understand the actual theology driving this unstructured approach, the text points to what's called the New Covenant.
It's basically a massive theological paradigm shift. It is a definitive move away from external religious structures, shifting to God dwelling internally within individuals. God's presence literally transitions from being housed in specific physical structures governed by rigid laws to residing permanently within the human hearts of all believers through the Spirit. Jesus was essentially preparing his followers for a time when they wouldn't even need a physical temple anymore because they themselves were becoming the temples.
So let's compare these two distinct theological eras side by side. You've got the Old Covenant. It relied heavily on laws written on inflexible tablets of stone. It had a localized presence stuck in a physical building, and it used a hierarchical system where only a select few were officially called into ministry. But then you have the New Covenant. Here, laws are written organically on human hearts, it's driven by an internal spirit, and, this is the absolute key, all believers are called to participate. The author impartially points out a pretty heavy irony here. By maintaining modern structures that elevate only a few called leaders and rely so heavily on physical buildings, a lot of modern institutions are actually anchoring people right back in that inflexible Old Covenant mindset. It's like Jesus said, you just can't put new wine into old wineskins. To take that kind of dense theology and make it a bit more accessible, the source brings up the Apostle Paul's metaphor of living letters. Back in Paul's day, people used physical letters of commendation to prove their credibility. But Paul argues that believers themselves are literally a letter from Christ, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. It is just a perfect illustration of this shift. You aren't meant to just hand someone a printed pamphlet or invite them to a scheduled seminar. Your very life, naturally interacting with your community, is the message.
So what does this actually look like in practice? The text breaks this paradigm shift down into 3 organic steps. Step 1, believers are filled with the Spirit of God. Step 2, believers interact organically within secular society. We're talking at work, at the grocery store, in their neighborhoods. And step 3, daily life naturally transforms into a continuous ministry of reconciliation. The source really highlights that believers aren't supposed to be tasked with this heavy, almost unnatural burden of dragging their friends to an organized church meeting. Instead, they just bring the kingdom of God directly into their own everyday lives, simply shining a light exactly where they already are.
Ultimately, Quack's entire analysis boils down to this one incredibly powerful realization. Life itself is the ministry. It is not an event you attend, it is not a building you commute to, and it's definitely not a blocked-out 2-hour slot on your weekly calendar. According to this analysis of Jesus, our daily, completely unstructured, chaotic existence is the true, intended arena for spiritual impact. When we finally stop viewing ministry as this compartmentalized, organized structure, we actually free ourselves up to impact the world in a way that is so much more authentic, continuous, and organic.
Which brings us to a pretty provocative final thought derived from the text. I want you to really chew on this. Do modern, organized structures actually help, or do they hinder the goal of everyday life as ministry? If Jesus deliberately avoided these structures so he could prioritize spontaneous, individual encounters, are the massive religious institutions we build today actually supporting this life as ministry paradigm, or are they inadvertently getting in the way by tying us back to an old covenant way of operating? It's an absolutely fascinating question, and one that completely shifts how we view the intersection of community, structure, and our ultimate purpose. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, keep analyzing the structures around you.